Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 in Azure Community webinar. My name is Laura, and I'm delighted to be joined by Aman, who will present the topic Information Protection in SharePoint. Don't forget to join in on today's conversation about today's webinar and more on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is #ESPC23. Don't forget to check out the Resource Centre. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the Content tab at the top. Continue your learning by joining us for the next webinar, Build Resilient Apps with Microsoft Graph Developer Proxy, which takes place on Monday, July 24th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. CEST. You can find out more at sharepointeurope.com/upcoming webinars. There are less than 2 weeks to go until this year's European Power Platform Conference. The European Power Platform Conference is right around the corner, and the anticipation is well and truly building. If you are interested in attending, then we highly advise you to book as soon as possible, as there are only 51 tickets left. Take a chance on something new and different. Spend time focusing on your learning, your skills, and your network. Booking a ticket to the European Power Platform Conference is an investment in yourself, your career, and even your company. Invest in you and book now. Visit sharepointeurope.com/Power Platform Conference pricing to grab your tickets while they're still available. The ESPC23 discount package is now available. Hybrid working and working from home brings new challenges for team collaboration, innovation, and culture. It is vital for your team's success to spend quality, focused time together. Being together allows for easier brainstorming, sharing insight, receiving tips, team building, and more. Time together in person can help you work better together and succeed faster in your projects. The ESPC team packages are designed to give your team an expert professional development experience with plenty of fun, team building, and networking included. Team discounts and packages cater to groups of 3 to 4, groups of 5 to 9, and groups of 10 plus, with savings of 15%, 20%, and 25%. Please visit sharepointeurope.com to find out more. So after the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question that you might have into the questions window at any stage, and questions will be selected and answered at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to today's webinar presenter, Aman. Hello, Aman.
Hello, hey guys, without wasting any time, I'll be just sharing my screen and we'll be talking about the agenda, what we're gonna cover today. So just give me a minute and then we'll start. Hopefully you guys are able to see my screen. So this is Aman this side. I work as a Microsoft Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft Norway and gonna speak around information protection and retention over the SharePoint. So this is going to be the agenda for this webinar. So I'll be speaking around sensitivity labels. I'll be speaking around data loss prevention, which will cover your information protection part. But then I will also be covering the retention policies and record management because we really need to make sure we will provide you complete holistic view of information protection and retention over the SharePoint. So we will start the day with the sensitivity labels, what the sensitivity labels are. So if I talk about the sensitivity label from Microsoft Purview information protection, I'll let you classify and protect your organization data. So you can apply classification in terms of sensitivity label on SharePoint documents and make sure you can protect and encrypt the data wherever they are flowing. So even if I talk about if the documents leaving outside your organization, and if you apply the sensitivity labels, the retention label or the sensitivity label will be persistent. So that's the beauty of the sensitivity label. And you can apply protection, you can apply encryption over your documents when they are sitting onto the SharePoint. That's one thing. But the other part is if I talk about the scope of the sensitivity label. So when I talk about the scope, it's item level. So when I talk about the item level, it's like files and documents and emails and meetings. But we're going to focus more on the documents because this is like more around the SharePoint. You can also apply sensitivity labels on groups and sites. So that's also called as the container level sensitivity label. Apart from that, we do have a feature in preview where you can apply the sensitivity label on the schematized data. So data or the SQL tables sitting on Azure. We will be talking about these two specifically. I'll not be touching the features which are still in preview because they might change before they pops up with general availability. So I'm going to show you a couple of demos how to create the sensitivity label and how to apply the sensitivity label when they are or when the documents are sitting onto SharePoint or OneDrive. So we'll be basically focusing upon the scope items and also the scope groups and sites. Now, when I talk about the sensitivity label, they come into different flavors. Obviously, we've discussed the scope, but when I talk about the different flavors, you can apply sensitivity label manually, and you can also apply sensitivity label automatically. Further down, we do have two flavors for applying the sensitivity labels automatically. The very first one going to be the client side labeling, which I'm going to talk about, and the second is service side auto labeling. So imagine a scenario: you have a document which is sitting on SharePoint in place documents, and you need to make sure you will cover your sensitive data or sensitive or business critical documentation. You can apply sensitivity label on those documents as well. So nutshell, what is sensitivity label? You can classify, you can protect, and you can encrypt your documents when they're sitting onto SharePoint and OneDrive. So now I'll be taking you to my demo tenant. I'll be showcasing you how to create them, and then I'll be running a quick demo of what the end user experience going to be when they apply the unified labeling or the sensitivity labels onto the SharePoint. So I'll quickly jump onto my Microsoft Purview portal, and then I will go down into my information protection where you can create the sensitivity label to classify your information or data. I will go into my labels. I will quickly create a label. Let's say I will do ESC, so that's European SharePoint Community, and then say confidential. So I will make sure this is ESC confidential, the classification which you apply on the document. I will say display name. So this is going to be the display name for this label. I will also say the description for the users, which is really important, and also the description for the admins. Now you can apply color coding to your labels as well. So earlier this wasn't available, but now we do have a user interface where you can apply color coding to the labels as well. I'll just skip this part. So I'll say next. Now this is a scope which I was talking about. You can apply on the item level. Item level covers your files, they covers your emails, they cover your meeting, and also you can apply onto groups and sites. So when I talk about groups and sites, you can apply them onto a SharePoint site or a Teams or the Office 365 group. You also have preview for the other scope, which is called as schematized data. Just to start with, I will be doing a demo on the item level, showcasing you what it is, and then we'll be focusing upon groups and sites. And in this, I'll be just focusing upon, let's say, files, because we are focusing at SharePoint. We are not focusing around emails as of now. So let's say this sensitivity label will be available when published over the SharePoint or OneDrive only. So now what you want to achieve with this sensitivity label? You can say apply content marking or apply encryption. So you have two actions here. So the very first one says you need to apply the encryption on the documents sitting onto SharePoint or OneDrive, and you can say assign permission now. So that means you are assigning permission over this sensitivity label right now. And then once a user will apply this sensitivity label to a content or a document and share the document with anyone, even outside the organization, your sensitivity label will be persisted, and only users having access to this sensitivity label would be able to render or see the data. So I would say this is allow permission now. User access to content expire. So do you wish a user will lose access to this content, let's say after a few days? If yes, you can specify a day. If no, that means user will receive a content with this sensitivity label. They will retain the access forever. Allow offline access. Will user be able to access this document offline? And you say always. So always doesn't mean literal always. They still need to authenticate after 30 days if they maintain, or if they really need to retain the offline access as well. Now you will provide the permission within this sensitivity label right now. You can say all users in your organization. You can also say any authenticated users. You can say users or groups. You can specify particular users and groups, and you can also specify external domains like your vendor partner or a channel partner, Hotmail, Gmail, anything. As of now, I would say right now. So that means all users within my domain will have access to this sensitivity label, and if somebody would share a document with this sensitivity label to them, they would be able to access. And then you can choose permission, which permission you need to apply. It's co-author, it's co-owner, reviewer, viewer, and custom. You also have the custom permission, where you can say, okay, people would only be able to see, they would not be able to print, they would not be able to reply, they would not be able to forward this document, nothing. So it's like you are controlling the level of permission you need to apply over this sensitivity label. With co-author, they can do everything. They can print, they can save, they can forward, but they cannot rename or remove the sensitivity label. So I would say I'll stick to the co-author. I would say save. I would say next. Do you wish to apply content marking? So content marking could be in a flavor of headers, footers, and watermarking. You can say, yes, I want to apply the watermarking. Let's say, yes, see. I would say next. Okay, just give me a minute. I will choose this, and then I will choose, yeah, should be fine. Go next. Okay. You can also apply label automatically. So this is called as client side labeling. So when I talk about the client side labeling, I was talking about, imagine a scenario, you have a sensitive information. Now, what is the definition of sensitive information? Depending upon different organization to organization, let's say a credit card could be a sensitive information for you, and you really want to make sure you are not dependent upon the users. You are rather dependent upon your automatic labeling to apply the labels automatically, rather being falling back and depending yourself onto the user. So what you can do is add a condition. If a document sitting onto SharePoint or OneDrive contains any sensitive information. Now, what is the sensitive information? You do have a lot of SITs, which is sensitive info types, available into your Microsoft Purview. Let's say credit card. So that means any document containing a credit card information will be applied this label automatically. So there are two flavors to it. One, you say automatic apply this label to any content sitting onto SharePoint and OneDrive. So anything, if a user is writing a document over a SharePoint and OneDrive, this label will be applied automatically. But that doesn't mean user cannot go back and change it. They can still change it. Or you can say recommend. So when a user is writing a document with the credit card information, this label will be recommended that this information or this piece of document is containing any sort of sensitive information, and as per your organization policy, this label is recommended. So this is called as automatic labeling. So that means you're not falling back to the user or dependent upon the user to apply the label manually, rather being the label will be applied automatically. I would say next. This is freezed out because this is groups and sites. I haven't covered groups and sites in it, and that is the reason it is freezed out. And then you will finish it. you have to publish it as well to make it available to the end user. Now, how you will publish it, I will just let you know. So you will go to the publish label. The first part is to create a label and then publish the label to the end user so that they can apply manually. Let's say you choose, I want to choose these three labels and publish the labels to users. And then I will not talk about admin units. It's still in preview, but you can create admin units. So admin units can comprise of devices and users where you can publish these sensitivity labels to admin units as well. But for this scope today, we're going to talk about where and to whom we need to publish this sensitivity label. So it's like users and groups. You can choose different users, you can choose different groups, you can choose mass rollout for your entire organization. But this does not depends upon the workload, rather this depends upon the users. So I would say for this demo purpose, all users. Now, user must provide a justification to remove a label or lower its classification. So hierarchy of the labels are really important. Let's say you have three labels. So one is internal, public, or let's say confidential. If a user will remove a label from a document later on, he has to provide a justification. If he is lowering the label, let's say he is going from confidential to a public or a confidential to internal, he has to provide the business justification. Require users to apply a label to their emails and document. This is called as mandatory labeling. So user cannot write the document on SharePoint or save the document on SharePoint without the labeling. So this is called as mandatory labeling. So that means user have to provide a label before it saves any document onto the SharePoint. You can also apply labels to Power BI, and you can also provide link to a user, which is a help page, your intranet page describing what the labels are and what is the purpose of those labels. You would say next, apply default label. This is called as default labeling. As soon as you will open a document in your web into SharePoint, a new document, any label which you want to publish, let's say demo general, will be applied automatically. So that means it will make sure a label will be applied, but based upon the criticality, user can change it later on. And then finally, you have to finish, and this label will be available for the end user to consume, and they can apply manually. Or as I've also shown you, the automatic version of it, the labels will be applied automatically based upon the sensitive information. Now, how would it look like? So if I talk about, let's say, a SharePoint site, I do have a SharePoint site which we can actually use. So if I talk about the SharePoint, I'll go to active sites. I'll choose a site ESC. And then I'll go to a documents. Within the documents, let's try to create one new document. Or I would say I'll create a new document. So this is the icon which you will use to apply the sensitivity label. And once you apply the sensitivity label, all the watermarking, all the encryption will be there with this document. Still processing. Add a sensitive information. I'll do like this. Select a label. And then I can apply the label. So I will apply the label as, let's say, this one. Okay. So now the label is applied. Come on. Okay. And the label is applied, and you can see the label with a locked sign here. And if there gonna be any sort of watermarking, you would see the watermarking on top. Even if you share this document outside the organization, this will be persisted, and users who would not have access to this document will not be able to open that without any sort of permission. So that's one thing. Now quickly jumping on to the next part, which was the group one. I will go to my label one more time, and then I'll create a new label. let's say demo. I'll say next. And now I will not cover item, I will cover groups insights, and I'll show you what is there into groups insights. You can choose privacy, and you can choose whether a user will be able to invite any guest or not. So that means when a user will create any sort of Office 365 group, a Teams, or a SharePoint site, whether they would be able to create a public SharePoint site or a private or a none, you can control from here. And also, if the owner of that SharePoint site or Office 365 group would be able to invite any guest or not. If you say no, even the owner would be not able to invite any guest into that Office 365 group. You can also control who would be able to invite or share the documents with. So that means anyone can do that. New and existing guest can, you can share the document with new and existing existing guest, and only people in your organization. So if you say, let's say, only people in your organization, users having access to that SharePoint site would not be able to share any document with the guest. So these sort of restrictions in terms of guest access, in terms of guest adding to the Office 365 group, and privacy can be achieved with the help of sensitivity label. So that was around sensitivity label, which you can use to apply encryption protection. And even if the users are sending those documents outside the organization, will be maintained, and people would not be able to access if they won't have access to a sensitivity label. I'll quickly jump on to the next one. We'll take all the questions at the end. We'll talk about the data loss prevention. Now, what is data loss prevention? So the sensitivity label, you can apply or classify the sensitivity label, but users would still be able to send this document outside the organization or outside the periphery of your organization. But if I talk about the data loss prevention, it can help you to avoid data leakage and data spillage. So when I talk about data leakage and data spillage, imagine a scenario, you have a business scenario or a organization scenario where a sensitive information should not be going outside the organization or shared outside the organization. That can be done with the help of data loss prevention. So that means you would not be able to share any sort of sensitive information outside the organization. That's you can hold with data loss prevention. Now, there are different, I would say, policies and the requirement for the policy. When I talk about the data loss prevention can be applied on different workloads for Office 365, SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange. You can also apply on your on-premises file shares. You can also apply on now Power BI, and also you can apply onto the devices. But we will talk about SharePoint and what condition you are looking for. So one of the condition could be you're looking for people should not be sharing a credit card information or a document containing a credit card information outside the organization. So imagine a scenario if a document is sitting onto your OneDrive, and if you try to share, and that document contains credit card information, and if you try to share outside the organization, they would not be able to do so because of the restrictions applied by a data loss policy. And then what action or restriction you need to enforce? Blocking the access, because you are trying to share that document outside the organization. I'll now quickly jump onto the demo and show you how to create it and what gonna be the end user experience for that. I'll say cancel. I'll go to my data loss prevention. I'll go to my policies. I'll say create a policy. Now I will say I need to create a custom policy. The policy name is restrict credit card number, let's say. I would say next. Now we do have a lot of locations, as I stated before, but I will only focus upon SharePoint, how it will work on SharePoint. I would say next. And now I need to create my condition. I can say I will create a rule. I would say SharePoint rule. Now, what is the condition? For me, the condition is if content is containing any credit card information. So for me, it's the condition. I can say content contain credit card information. I can choose it from here. I can also say if you have labeled the content with high confidence data, let's say add it here, sensitivity label. You can also apply a condition around retention label, which we're going to talk about soon. So I can say if the document is high confident data, and you can apply the condition with and or, so that is possible, and that is possible from here. So any of these or all of these. So once that has been done, you can also say add a condition here if you want to do that. Content from, so you're targeting people inside the organization or outside the organization. So one of the factor is your organization is fine sharing the content inside the organization, but they're not fine sharing the content outside the organization. Then you can say it is shared outside the organization. What is the action or restriction you want to apply? You really want to block access to everyone if they are outside the organization. So that means this one. Or you say, no, I really want everybody, even internal to the organization, will be blocked. Document will not be blocked for the last modifier, owner of the document, and the site administrator, which is clearly mentioned here. For files in SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, only the owner, last modifier, and site admin will have access. Apart from that, all the internal users and external users will lose access. And if you just choose the last setting, all the external user will lose the access once this has been applied. So this is how you will apply and create a restriction. You can also apply, in terms of if there is a document which is being hit by this data loss prevention policy and you have to send an email to the administrator, you can send the email to the administrator as well. One of the other factor is you can also provide the business justification. Imagine a scenario, you have a document and a DLP policy hits the document and says, no, this you cannot send outside the organization because the DLP policy do not permits that. Now imagine a scenario, you have a business justification to share that information outside the organization. Maybe your HR department or a CTO or a finance department or a CEO might have asked you to do that, or it's a false positive or a false negative. It says it contains a credit card information, but then you really know it's not containing any sort of credit card information. In those scenario, you can provide a business justification, which will be recorded into a DLP dashboard and would be able to send that information outside the organization, but only if your organization will enable that functionality. I'll quickly show you how it behaves onto OneDrive. So if I go to my OneDrive, I'll cancel this. I'll just quickly go to my OneDrive. I'll go to my files. I'll create a new folder, which is ESC, let's say, create. I'll go to a folder. I'll upload a file which is containing a credit card information. So I already have a policy which says block, access to that file if there is a credit card information. So I'll just upload. I'll upload from my desktop. So let's say credit card. So now it will scan a newly added document. It will take a continuous scroll. Once the continuous scroll is completed, it will block, or it should block, the document. So I'll just quickly refresh. So as I stated, it can take a few seconds to crawl because it's the very first continuous scroll which will take an effect. It can take a couple of seconds depending upon how large the data is. So now you see this red icon. So that means it's been blocked. I can actually go to this view policy, and I'm not sure whether you are able to follow, and then I can see issue. It's contain a credit card information. So now nobody would be able to access it apart from the owner of the document, apart from the last modified, and apart from the site administrator. So this is how you would be able to block the documents internal or external to the organization. So that's about the data loss prevention. Okay, apart from, so we have talked about sensitivity labels, we have talked about the scope of the sensitivity label, we've talked about data loss prevention. So sensitivity label is more about providing encryption and protection. Even if the document is going outside the organization, you can also provide content marking. But if I talk about the data loss prevention, it's more about um, saving you from data leakage or data spillage outside the organization. So user would not be able to share the documents outside the organization or inside the organization, depending upon the sensitive information. Now let's talk about the retention policy, because it's really important how you will deal with retaining the data. So different organization comply with different compliance policy. You might have the obligation to retain the customer data for, let's say, 5 years or a 7 year. You can do that with the help of retention policy. You also want to make sure users are working with active documents. So imagine a scenario: you have a SharePoint site which is like huge or humongous in number, let's say few gigabytes, and whenever a user is searching for a document, they're also getting the obsolete data in return, and users are quite furious. And then your organization have decided to clean the SharePoint site, which contains, or let's say, a document which is like 5 years older, and you really want to clean it. So you can also delete those documents with the help of retention policy. And then it's really important to create the retention policy. Retention policy is not as a backup. We are not containing any sort of backup. Rather, we are just retaining the content for a specified period of time, or you can also delete the content which is older than a specified period of time. That's called as retention. We will talk about how retention works onto SharePoint shortly, but before that, I'm going to show you a quick flavor of retention policy. I'll cancel this. I'll say confirm. Now, when I talk about the retention policy, I will quickly jump onto my data lifecycle management. I will go to my Microsoft 365. I will go to my retention policy. So that means now you want to retain the data for a specified period of time. I would say uh, retain SharePoint data. Next. Now, you can specify what is the scope of the policy. So we can say whether you are doing adaptive scopes. Now, adaptive scopes are more granular. When I say granular, you can apply this retention policy to a specific business unit. So let's say users whose department is equal to sales, or the SharePoint sites with a wildcard array which belongs to a sales department or a finance department. You can just make sure this retention policy will be applied to those business segments. On the other hand, if you want to apply on a global level, you can use a static scope where you can say all the SharePoint site, your SharePoint Classic and Communication site, and also SharePoint site which are there with, or which are like Office 365 group connected sites. You would say next. Now, how long you need to retain the data? You do have three, I would say, templates. You can also create a custom template even for one day. So let's say I want to retain a data for SharePoint for 5 years. And then you would say when the items created. So that means if the item is older than 5 years, that will be removed or that will not be retained, depending upon what action you will apply. We will talk about that. Or also when the items were last modified. The difference is this 5 years will be counted on the item from the creation date. If you say the last modified, every time a document will be modified, the retention period will be recycled back to 5 years automatically. I highly recommend to all the customer, for all the business critical data, they should be using when items were last modified. So that means every time you are modifying the document, it will just make sure the retention period will be recycled. Now let's say this one. Now after the 5 years, what will happen to a document depends upon your action. Delete item automatically. So that means you're enforcing the retention policy to delete item. Do nothing. That means we will stop retaining the content, but we will not touch the original item in place. It will still be there into your SharePoint or OneDrive. You can also say retain items forever if you really wish to have it, or you can say delete items. So this was a case which I was discussing around to clean up your SharePoint site. Let's say you really want to make sure documents which are older than 7 years on your SharePoint, when they were created, you want to delete them. this will help you to clean the SharePoint sites or OneDrive as well. So it's basically retention and deletion period. So once that has been done, imagine a scenario: you have this SharePoint site, and I will just show you something. So site content. So as of now, this is a newly created SharePoint site. As of now, I only have these 5 document libraries. I will go to a document library. I will just try to delete this document, what I have. Come on. So just give me a minute. I will try to just delete it. I delete this. Now this document will be going to your recycle bin, where it will be spending 93 days, first recycle bin and a second recycle bin. But alternatively, it will also create a preservation hold library for you. So when I talk about the preservation hold library, I'll just show you. Just give me a minute. I'll quickly go in here. I choose my preservation text. So I'll just take a shortcut for the preservation library, and then I will go in here. And you see the document which I have deleted, it will also be sent into a preservation hold library, which is only visible to a document or a site collection administrator. So that means it's really important. This is not visible to all the users. So that means for the next 7 years, the document will be maintained here. So that's how a retention policy will work. For the retention part, we also have retention labels. Now, what is the difference between sensitivity label and retention label? Sensitivity label provides you encryption and protection. Retention label will provide you retention of the documents, which users can apply manually based upon the criticality of the document. So I can say, I will go to my labels. I say create a label. Now user have to apply it manually, or it can also be applied automatically. I would say retention for 1 year. So you can provide different or leverage different retention labels: 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, or 4 year. And based upon that, user will work with the documents. And then based upon the criticality of the documents, they can decide how long they need to retain the documents. You would say next, retain item forever or for a specific period of time. You see the same window as what we had into retention policy. This is retention label. And then there we had 2 options. One is when items were created, when items were last modified. There we have third option, when the items were labeled as well. So your retention period will start once the user will label this item. So I would say once a user will label this item manually, the retention period will start for next 7 years. I would say next, after the retention period, delete items automatically. Start disposition review. So disposition review is the mail will be sent to the administrator that the document is coming to an end of life cycle. Do you want to extend the retention? Do you want to apply a different label, or do you provide your consent to delete the documentation? So this is a pre-stage deletion. Until and unless disposition review will be done, the document will still be intact on the original location. You can change the label after 7 years from X to Z. I would say that you can run a Power Automate flow to apply a different label or copy a document to a different location. This is pretty much new. Most users and customers are started exploring this as well. What to do after the retention is over? Do we need to apply a different label? Do we need to move a document to a different SharePoint site or the archival site? That can be done with the help of Power Automate as well. And deactivate retention settings. So these are the actions. And then if I talk about the different actions, and then you will review it. Once you will review it, you will publish this retention label as well. And once the retention label is published, user will be able to consume it. So that's really, really important, and start applying the retention label manually. We will talk about that. I'll show you the demo as well. That's about how you apply retention labels. We also talked about retention settings or retention policies over SharePoint. So one of the example for the retention policy, because I am now discussing now, because both retention label and retention policy at the back end, they're retaining the content. Retention policy is, so basically the difference between a retention policy is it's on the workload level, where user would not have visibility whether the organization have applied any sort of retention policy. But retention labels are more user focused, where they can apply the retention label manually based upon the criticality of the document. So imagine a scenario: you have a SharePoint site where you have applied a retention label or a retention policy, and the retention policy says deletion afterwards. If the document will be deleted, let's say after 2 years, rest 3 years it will be spending into a preservation hold library, which I've shown you. And once there is a timer job running into a preservation hold library, which says, okay, the next command is after 5 years, I have to delete these documents. So 2 years plus 3 years, it's 5 years. And then the document will be deleted, but we will not abruptly delete the document. It will be landing into the recycle bin for 93 days, and then it will be deleted. So that's how it works when it comes to the retention policy on SharePoint. So again, I've talked about retention label. You can leverage a retention labels based upon the different forms and documents. User can leverage and apply the retention labels manually. So with retention label, obviously enable people in your organization to apply a retention label. They can apply manually, they can apply automatically, and you can also apply retention label on a document library level. I'll first quickly touch upon how to apply retention label automatically, and then I'll show you a demo for the next 5 minutes. Okay, so this is how you create a retention label. And then you need to publish the retention label as we did for a sensitivity label as well. So that's how the retention label can be consumed into different workloads or different platforms. But you can also apply retention label automatically. So when I talk about automatically based upon the trainable classifiers, based upon the sensitive information type, you can apply the labels automatically as well. So now I'm talking about the retention label. I'm not talking about the sensitivity label. So let's say uh, credit card. So I would say next. Based upon when the item contain any sort of sensitive information, any sort of keywords or phrases, any sort of trainable classifiers. Example for the trainable classifiers is harassment, profanity, or offensive language. Or you can also apply this onto the attachment links when shared from Exchange, Teams, and Yammer. I would say for this demo contains sensitive information. I would say custom. Next. And I would say if a document is containing any sort of credit card information, that document will be applied a retention label automatically. So I would say static scope, because I'm leveraging this onto my SharePoint. I would just close everything only onto the SharePoint and Office 365 group, because all the Office 365 group contains a sensitive information. So it will give you two options. One, you can run this into a simulation mode. So that means it will scan all the documents onto a SharePoint and showcase you that these are a set of documents which are there into your SharePoint, which you can apply a retention label, or you can just say turn on the policy. So once you will turn on the policy, the label what you have mentioned into info a label tab will be applied directly onto the documents based upon those sensitive information what you have defined. So this is how you apply a retention label, but there is a second part to it as well. Record management, which comes with E5 license, which you have to go to record managements. There are two major options within your record management. It will feel and look like absolutely same creation of a retention label, but you can mention your document or content as record. Let's say record. Next, retain items forever. This is as same as creation of the retention label. But now you have the other option where you can mark item as record and also mark item as a regulatory record. Now, what is the difference? We will talk about shortly, because you really want to make sure if a document is sitting for a SharePoint site, should not be changed, should not be deleted. You need to mark it as a record, because that's your record, and that's the organization obligation where you need to maintain that record onto a SharePoint site. The regulatory record, this option is not enabled by default onto your tenant. So if I choose this, you will have a warning. You won't be able to delete this item after it's created. You'll only be able to increase the retention period or publish it. That means First thing, we have not enabled this by default. Second thing, you have to enable this with the help of PowerShell. Third thing, once you create this label, you would not be able to delete this label. You would only be able to elevate the restrictions. Now I'll show you the end user experience to it. I'll quickly go in here. I will go to my documents. I would say a new document. Document is created. I'll close this. I'll just refresh it. And then you have a document, which you choose a document. And then you would be able to apply the retention label. Choose a label. And then let's say I will minimize this. Just give me a minute, guys. And then you can say, I want to apply a retention label. And then the retention label is applied here. And just to see that, you can go to a library settings. So you can also apply, let's say I'll go to my library settings. I'll go to my library information. I can add a column for the retention label just to make sure that user would understand, what sort of retention label we need to apply. Just give me a minute. And then I would say documents. I'll move it to here. And then I would say okay. So you see retention label dummy. And if I want to change it, I'll now show you the magic. And now this document will be retained for the specified period which you have mentioned into the dummy retention label. Now I'll show you the magic of record as well. So let's say you want to make sure this is a record. I will change this to a different retention label. Let's say from dummy, I will say employee record. So now if I open this document, or let's try to delete this document. I'll try to delete this document. It will give me an error that I'm not able to, or a warning that I'm not able to delete that. I'll try to open this document. So this is in a readable format. I would not be able to make any change to this document. This is only into readable document. Now imagine a scenario because this I have marked as record. Now imagine a scenario you have marked a document as record, and after a year a contract or a statement will change into a sales contract or a vendor contract, and your organization want to change it. You can go in here. With every record you have this lock and unlock button. You can unlock this button. All the users who have more than contributor access would be able to lock and unlock, and every time you will lock and unlock, the audit log will contain the entry of it as well, that who has done the lock and unlock part. Now if I open this, I would still not be able to delete it because it is a record, but I would be able to make a change. Now if I wish, I can just make anything, let's say first change. So that means now I have the changed maintain, and after that I can again go and lock it. I can change the lock and unlock stated to amend the statement, but I would not be able to delete this despite it is locked or unlocked. As a admin for the site, I can also change the label now. So if I really want to apply a different retention label, I can do that. So basically a difference between record and regulatory record is you would be able to make changes into a document when it is in the unlock status. But if I now apply a regulatory record, let's say this is my regulatory record, it will give me the warning again. After it's applied, you won't be able to edit or delete the item, and neither you or nor administrator in your organization will be able to change it. So let's say I want to change it. It is giving me option to change any retention label because this is a record. But once I will go in here let's say I will go in here and I change this to a regulatory record. I say apply. Now, if I go back in again in the information pane, I'm the administrator and a global administrator, and I'm clicking on this, it will not allow me to change my retention label either. So it has been completely logged for next 7 years. That's how it works. So it's completely packed. You can also apply a retention label onto a document library level if you want. So this is also one of the flavor for the automatic labeling onto a document library level, where you can say apply retention label onto a document library. So I will do like this and do like this. I can choose my label, let's say 1 year, and I can say that every document now which is falling into this document library will inherit the retention label from this document library. So every document will be inheriting the document library, the retention label. You can also say all the existing document can inherit the retention label from the document library level. I would say save. And now if I create any document, that should inherit the label automatically without applying manually. And then I say this, I will refresh my screen and it should be applied a retention label automatically. You see, 1 year demo. So that means it has inherited the retention label directly from the document library level. So basically, this is what we cover in terms of sensitivity label, data loss prevention, retention policy, and record management. This is just the holistic view. If you demand tomorrow to have more insight and deep dive into different functionality, we can also arrange that. So that was my part, to be very honest, in terms of defining the retention label. Any questions on that part? Now I open the forum for all the question and answer.
Thank you, Aman, for a great presentation. So we will get straight into the questions and answers part now. So again, if anyone wishes to ask a question, please feel free to type it into the questions window now. So the first question I have in here is, when you are saying SharePoint, are you talking only about SharePoint Online, or is Purview also available for SharePoint on-premise?
So depending upon what you need to achieve, I mean, as of now, the Purview is only available for the SharePoint Online, but there are bits and pieces of the functionality which is available for on-premises as well. Like one of the example, if you want to render the sensitivity label only onto SharePoint Online, you need to extend that to AIP Scanner, and with the help of AIP Scanner, you would also be able to identify and label the SharePoint on premises as well. If I talk about the data loss prevention as well, you can extend the data loss prevention policy to your file shares as well with the help of AIP Scanner. But you have to install the AIP Scanner and then extend the functionality. But not all functionalities are extendable. So as I stated, you can extend sensitivity labels, you can extend DLP, but not retention labels and retention policy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aman. So another question is, are you saying encryption works as rights management?
So encryption definitely work as the right management, because at the back end it's RMS, information right management. So you can just infuse the permissions while writing down, I would say, the sensitivity label. And once user receive the documentation with that particular sensitivity label, it will actually check or validate your information right management, and based upon that, it will render the document. So if a user would not have any access into that, they would not have access to a document content.
Brilliant. And then another question is, whom justification will go? Is someone needed to approve and then only classification can be lowered?
No. So if you are the owner of the content, you can lower down the classification. justification need not to be approved. It will just be rendered into the unified audit log and sensitivity logs just for the sake of the compliance administrator. But if you are the owner and you really want to lower down the classification, you can do that. You just need to provide the justification, but you don't need to wait for any approval. So you can do that at the spot on.
Brilliant. And then another question is, if users download the document on the endpoint and then share it using any other way rather than sending a SharePoint link, how does this Purview DLP control it?
You can also apply, in the beginning, I've also stated you can apply the data loss prevention policy onto different platforms. You can also apply the retention policy, or the data loss prevention policy onto the endpoint. So that means any document they have downloaded will be scanned, and if they're trying to share that document, let's say via a third party storage device or a USB, you can apply the restriction on those documents as well. But you have to create a data loss prevention onto the endpoint management as well. So we can leverage the same data loss prevention policy on your SharePoint, Exchange, Power BI, data, endpoint devices. So it will work as is, but you have to extend the data loss prevention if user is trying to download any document from SharePoint to their endpoints. Once you have the endpoint data loss prevention, it will take care of that as well.
Brilliant. Then someone else is just asking, does retention data use your allocated SharePoint tenant allowance, or is it separate?
Yes, it will use your allocated space. So that's a bit of challenge, that you really need to make sure you have control on your space as well, because it will just make sure it will consume your allocated space.
Brilliant. And another question is, can we set retention based on document library or the site collection? For example, some documents shouldn't be deleted ever. However, others can be deleted after 5 or 10 years.
Yes, so you can create different folders because you can apply retention labels onto a folder level as well. So one is you can apply retention label or a document library. Every document will be inheriting that if you have selected that setting, or you can also say you have folders within a same document library, apply a retention label onto a folder level, and any document going into that particular folder level will inherit the retention label from the folder level. So basically you can have a different set of retention label within those folders, and documents will just follow through the inheritance from the folder level instead of doing from the document library level.
Brilliant. So another question here is, what property of the object name of items in SPO that calculate last modified date and they're on about in the metadata of the item?
So one of the example I would like to give you. So if I talk about, so this is one of the general discussion what I had into a different webinar, that what if a document is old, let's say 5 year older, and it is sitting onto a user desktop, and if he just drops that onto a SharePoint, will the type frame will be calculated from there, or will the time frame will be calculated once the documents will be created and dropped into SharePoint? It will always calculate the time frame or a last modified date when the document will be dropped or created into SharePoint. If the document is 10 years older and you drop it into a SharePoint, it will take the current modified date. It will not take the previous 10 years.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amar. And just one or two more questions then. So someone is asking another question about the sync time from creation of a label and it takes effect. So for sensitivity labels, retention labels, adaptive scope using EA.
Yeah, so normally what we recommend, it can take up till 24 hours. Normally it is fast, but within 24 hours, once you publish the label, be it retention label or a sensitivity label, that should be available within your SharePoint. So that's the time frame what we recommend, but it's normally much faster than that. But again, as per the recommendation, you might have to wait for 24 hours.
Brilliant. So someone else is asking, can we configure the labels such that the scanning would be based on the document name or type aside from the contents?
You can definitely do that with the help of metadata, but then you have to rely back on the Microsoft SDK, and you need to have sort of development skills where the documents will be read against the metadata and will be applied a sensitivity label.
Brilliant. So another question then, is DLP for endpoints be agent-based or agent-less?
It will be agent based. So you do have a set of pre-requirements which you need to serve in order to onboard your client or device into endpoint data loss prevention policy. That has a rule of prerequisite. You make sure need to have the license, make sure minimum Windows version, make sure that your client is onboarded, make sure it is like hybrid joined or Azure joined. So all those prerequisite has to be served before the endpoint DLP can be implemented or client or the device.
Brilliant. So the last question then I have here is, if you set a sensitivity label on a SharePoint site, for example, confidential, do you still need to classify a file in a document library with the same label?
You can do that with the same label. You can also do that with a different label. So as of now, if you apply a sensitivity label on a container level, documents will not inherit from the site. So we are working on that part, but you can apply a sensitivity label onto a document library level, as we have discussed for the retention label. You can also do that for a sensitivity label. And once you apply a sensitivity label on a document library level, the documents which is into that document library level will inherit the sensitivity label. But as of now, yes, you have to apply that manually. You can also do that automatically, but they won't inherit the sensitivity label from a container level. We are into that process, but as of now, you can push the documents to inherit the sensitivity level from the document library level. That is possible.
Brilliant. So that is all the questions that we have in here today. So I'll just wrap up the Q&A session. And just before we finish up, I just want to say a huge thank you again, Aman, on behalf of the ESPC community, to yourself for taking the time today to carry out this webinar. We really do appreciate it.
Yep, thank you. Honor is on mine. Thank you.
So that is the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. That is it for today, folks. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today. Take care, and we hope that you'll join us again for more learning. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.